You are currently the only person in this conference.
The exam before our time. Your expectation. All right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. So the plan for today's class, as you already know, we're going to have a look at this comprehensive question. Now, we're also going to talk about what kind of your expectations for the exam. So I just want to make sure that you guys know right off the bat that the fact that we're looking at this comprehensive question does not mean that your exam will be in this kind of a format, that you're getting one big giant question. Your questions will be essentially one question per chapter, so it will be broken up. So I just want to establish that, but we'll talk a little bit more about the exam before our time is up today. And I know this question is a huge question. You've had a little bit of time to look at it. But I wanted to go through this a little bit just to give you guys a sense, just to kind of bring everything together that we've been learning and wrap a little bit of a bow on that so you can see, if you're in practice, if you're taking care of a client that has a bunch of complications, which often they do if they're coming to an accountant, what that might look like and how this all comes together, right? So we've gone through 10 chapters. We've covered all these different income sources, all their different rules. We've talked about some special deductions for retirement, for childcare costs, moving expenses. We've talked about business income and CCA and income from, the sale of shares, income from a rental property. We've got all of this stuff. Back before the midterm, we talked about tax credits and residency and how to calculate net income for tax and taxable income and all of that stuff. So this is just a question that I think is a good one for you guys to review. If you can achieve a question like this, then you have a real good understanding of what we have gone through, and it just kind of brings it all together. I'm looking at Adam's question here, or comment. Perfect. That's what I was worried about with a couple massive questions that hits on each chapter. Yeah. So the exam will be in the format of 6 questions, kind of one per chapter, without, any question. There may be one a little larger, but most of them will be roughly the same size. And there could be one in there that's a little bit bigger, if it had a little more to work with. But it will be kind of chapter based. It won't be comprehensive like this giant question. But just as practice and as running through it, if you can achieve this question, then you should be able to handle what's going through. But mostly it's just because I think it brings it together. This is the goal, right? You have a client, they come to you, they have a smattering of all these different issues or items to be dealt with, and you want to be aware of all those and know what to bring in and how to handle it. So as you can see, this question here was several pages long. We've got a family. We've got Roland, who's married to Rachel. Since university, they got a couple of healthy children. So again, as you're going through a question like this or any shorter question, turn off my ringer here. There we go. As you're going through a question or a scenario, we need to learn all these things about a person because it all feeds into the tax. So I like to joke that, being a tax preparer is a great job for somebody who's nosy, but not really like that. Obviously, privacy is huge. It's more about interested in things, interested in business, interested in how things work, because what you're doing is like a mechanic. You're looking under the hood. Right? You're given a good examination of everything to see what's going on so that you can properly treat it for tax. So a simple example as somebody's health, the health of their children, that can factor into things like a medical claim or claim tax credits for disability, all that kind of stuff. And as that trusted advisor, most people are very sensitive about their financial, what their income is, what their health conditions may be. But once you're talking to your accountant, your tax preparer, you kind of got to let that all go because they need to know all these things. So, we go through this and as you read through a question, these items you should be thinking of them from a tax perspective. So if it had said, they have one perfectly healthy child, and then they have another child with a disability, you immediately think, okay, there's going to be some tax credits involved. And when it comes to the final exam, there is a little bit of a comprehensive element to this. You will still have to calculate a few tax credits. Now, you're not going to have a 30-point question about tax credits. But you will potentially have a little piece that says, okay, so you did this for Jimmy. Well, what about his tax credits? Or a question not comprehensive like this, but a question where you've calculated somebody's income and then it says, oh, and by the way, tell me what their tax payable would be. So you're still going to have to do that stuff we did in Chapter 4, where you multiply by the tax rates and calculate your tax credits. So that's not going to go away. So there's that little bit of a comprehensive element. And I mean, if we look at this question, we go through a whole lot of stuff. And we're not going to go through this question in exhaustive detail. You guys can kind of look at it on your own, but it's more just to bring it together. So in Part B, you know, we're looking at Rachel, for example, this part here where you calculate the taxes and figure out a handful of tax credits that they qualify for, you will be still expected to do that on the final exam. Particularly, you'll notice here, this question has a dividend tax credit. And we certainly learned about dividend tax credits. That's Chapter 7 material. So I'm not just going to give you a question, you know, maybe that said, oh, here's a dividend tax credit. It might come in the middle of another question because it's a fairly short, you know, somebody got a dividend, you gross it up, you do a tax credit. That's not a 20-point question. So it could be a small part in another question. So that's why this question here, I wanted you guys just have a look at to just kind of see how it all comes together. Let's go back to the start here. And as we go through it, you know, I'll mention some things about the exam and we'll talk about that a little more as well. So we had Roland and Rachel. Those are the two adults. They have a couple of children, which is Richard and Roxanne. Of course, when you have the children, then you need to know their ages, their incomes. That stuff can factor in. Let's see here, particularly if there was childcare, disability credits. So you need to know the main details about the family. We have a big old medical expense claim here. So we're given a whole bunch of stuff here at the top of page 497. Then we have Rachel has business income. So often that's what will bring somebody, all the stuff we learned in Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Often that business income is what brings a person, you know, to an accountant to get their taxes done. We go through here. Sorry, just get Adam's comment here. Adam says, I'm assuming for the same thing as the questions we have been doing, are we going to be ignoring HST, GST for the final? Yes, that is correct. Everything will be using 2020 rates, and we will be ignoring GST, HST in any of this. So also, we have practiced with some forms, filling in forms. During class, we did a couple of different forms. There will not be any forms on the final exam. So you guys don't have to stress out about exactly how those forms work. It was good for us to get some practice, but that will not be tested on the final exam. The questions will be more in the format and type that we've been working with through the text. So as usual, as far as studying, problems we did in class, assignment questions, all of that type of material, that's the kind of questions you should expect. Any topics that we stressed in class, that's what we'll be looking at. Ones that we didn't spend any time on at all, you're not going to see much, if any, of that on the exam. So Rachel's got business income. It puts an interesting item here on page 497. It says From childhood, Rachel has been embarrassed by the size and shape of her nose. Since her clients put a lot of emphasis on looking beautiful, Rachel felt that her nose stood in the way of getting more important clients and had a rhinoplasty surgery in 2019. It was not required for medical reasons. Unfortunately, complications from the surgery in 2019 resulted in a significant decrease in her revenues for that year. She was also very disappointed with the results of the surgery. Okay, so some of that information is relevant, some of it isn't. As with, any interview, meeting with a client, you're going to learn a lot about them. They're not sure what matters, doesn't matter, and they're just talking to you. So you have to sort through the information you're receiving, what's relevant, what isn't relevant, and sometimes make some decisions on things like what can we include in an expense claim. So an example in this one with the medical expenses, this, because it was not required for medical reasons, right? This was purely for aesthetics, then that would be an example of an expense that wouldn't be included. Not deductible as a business expense to get clients, also not deductible from a medical perspective. So again, we're not going to, it'd probably take us a long time to go through every detail of this question, but more just looking at how this all comes together. So one of the things that you could certainly be expecting on the exam is to deal with a client that has business income, to be able to calculate net business income, to be able to calculate that business's CCA claim, right? So that's Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. That stuff is all fair game. The heavy concentration of the exam will be from Chapter 5 through 10, the last 6 chapters, with a small amount of points being, kind of based on that general structure of how do we add up all our income, multiply it by the tax brackets, and then claim our tax credits to get to a bottom line of what do we owe. That's where we want to bring this. So there will be a small amount of points dedicated to bringing it full circle. Not a question of this nature, a smaller one where you already know the figures and you're just kind of putting it together. So in other words, there will not be a detailed residency question. There will not be a detailed employment expenses or employment income question, well, except for when your employment income is needed in order to calculate for RRSP. So that, see, there's a little, really, the stuff that carries forward is carrying forward because you need it for those other things. So there is a cumulative element to it, but the questions, we're not going to have a question for every single chapter, put it that way. It'd be focused on 5 forward with a little bit of those elements of things we've learned before. So in this question, we're lining up our revenue, our different deductible expenses. There could be expenses in a question that are given that aren't deductible, that you have to make that choice and say, well, this doesn't, you've had that before where it was, say maybe it was clothing, somebody bought a suit and tie, because they wanted to look good for a business meeting, that type of thing, not going to be deductible. So calculating net business income is certainly on the table. And here in this question, we've done that for Rachel. And we're certainly not deducting the rhinoplasty as a business expense, just like we wouldn't deduct clothing. And we wouldn't deduct, say, green fees for golf, things of that nature that aren't considered a business or a deductible business expense. So Here you got more examples, right? All your CCA calculations. We've practiced all that stuff. Make sure you're comfortable with all of the CCA calculations. You know, your recapture, your terminal loss, all that kind of stuff. So here in this question, she's got some different CCA classes, and that gets those numbers all get crunched. So she has business income. Then Rachel also has some Chapter 7 income. So that's her Chapter 5 and 6 stuff. Chapter 7, income from investments. So that's income from property. So we line up all of that income. She had a capital gain, right? So that's our Chapter 8 stuff. She had eligible dividends, which we have to gross up. When they're eligible, we do the 38%, right? If they were non-eligible, we would gross up by 15%. And she had some interest income. So if you have money on deposit or if you loan somebody money, that would be property income as well. So she's got various sources of income that's pulling from the rules we've learned in different chapters, Chapter 5 and 6, Chapter 7, and Chapter 8 with the capital gains. So when it comes to the end, how do we bring all this stuff together? So we've been learning chapter by chapter the special rules for all our different income sources. Employment, business, like self-employed, unincorporated business, property income, capital gains income, and then we added some other odds and sods, retirement income, things of this nature, and odds and sods of different deductions that one might claim. So at the end, once you've got all of that, you bring it all together in a pot, right? So here we've got her business income. They've called it in the solution here income from investments. This technically includes both her capital gains and her property, but that's fine because the capital gains have already been cut in half. So all the rules have already been followed here. There was some home buyers plan income. There was an RSP deduction that was calculated, right? So our Chapter 10 stuff. Make sure if you haven't already gone back, I posted a lecture that covered all of the RSP, all of the Chapter 10 stuff. So make sure that you go back and watch that. That Chapter 10 is all examinable. You will definitely have an RSP question, and you do have one on the assignment as well. So there's the deduction. So you've got all your sources of income, then any of these special deductions, RSP. She had a self-employed business, so she contributed. When you have a self-employed business, you have to pay the CPP that your employer would normally pay. So that means that you are going to have paid in to CPP. So make sure that you include a deduction for CPP. There's a little funky calculation. This used to be a little more simple, but there's a little funky calculation for it, and that's detailed here in note 4. You guys could have a look at that. But basically, for what the story is behind that is when you are your own employer, I think we've talked about this in a previous class, you have to pay the employer portion. The employer portion is deductible. The employee portion is not deductible. So we have that $3,064. That's the amount it'll be if you max out. So we have net income for tax purposes, which is also taxable income, of $248.99 for Rachel. There's some notes here, this is good practice on a few items that can come up. You know, it's a practice of a calculation for RRSP. That's all there. That's our chapter 10 stuff. But basically what this question shows you is all of that income and all of those special deductions, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10 for the RRSP, that stuff all comes together in one ball at the end. We followed the rules, and now it's all in one ball. We can take that number and multiply it by our tax rates. So don't forget how this little piece works. This now is our chapter 4 piece. So we take that income, the 214,364 that we calculated before, and we multiply it by our rates, and then subtract out our tax credits. So everybody's got access to that basic personal amount. This is where there'll be a medical expense tax credit, donations, the dividend tax credit. You will definitely have a question with the dividend tax credit because that's new stuff from chapter 7. Again, I'm not gonna, don't stress out too much about the chapter 4 stuff. I'm not gonna give you one that has a list of 12 tax credits with a whole bunch of complicated stuff. Just be prepared to do some of the basics. If the person has employment income, right, they're going to have certain credits that relate to employment income. They're always going to have CPP. They're always going to have EI. They're always going to have that basic Canada employment amount. So make sure, and they're going to have their basic personal amount. So the question could have, a small handful of basic tax credits. Make sure that you're just good with those basic type credits that are going to come through. And we should have that knowledge from chapter 4. Looking at Adam's question, would there ever be a time where we would have to calculate the unused deduction room at January 1st with the RRSP maximum? Okay, so what Adam's referring to here is with your RRSP, we always have a number that we start with. So like in this question, it was given. I believe, let me just check here. If I recall correctly, in your yeah, so like in your assignment, you had an assignment question here. And in that one, you're given the okay, yeah, I think in the assignment question, it might have been a little bit convoluted the way they explained what you started with. So that unused deduction room at the start will be given in the question. That's your starting point. The RSP deduction room is a cumulative balance. You have an amount that you start with. You have the amount that you add to it, the lesser of your limit, and 18% of your earned income from the year before that gets added in. So these figures will be given in the question. So this is another little sample of a solution for that. I think maybe in the just as a side note there, in the question for the assignment in question 3 part C, where you're doing the maximum deductible RRS or the maximum penalty free RRSP contribution, in that question on the assignment, it worded it a little bit weird about how you got your starting point. Your starting point on that is the 2020 dollar limit. Your starting point for that one was the 26,500. On the exam, it'll just tell you unused deduction room at January 1 is this much. It'll be straightforward. That was, I think, a little bit confusing the way it worded it. You could figure it out, but a little bit harder or more confusing on the assignment. Also on the assignment, or also related to RRSP, remember, be careful when you read the question. That question said the maximum penalty-free RRSP contribution. So the maximum penalty-free amount is your maximum deductible contribution plus 2,000. It's just giving you a little bit more wiggle room. You can go over the max by 2,000 without a penalty. That's different than what you can deduct. So in this question, we are calculating Rachel's deduction room. The room is your cumulative, pot of what you have to work with. So you're going to have an opening balance. You're going to add some in. That's how much room you're going to have. From that, then we have to look at how much did you actually contribute and how much are we going to deduct. Let's see, what do we have here? Yeah, because see, in this question we had $240,899, and that includes an RRSP deduction. So that's your taxable income in the two chunks, 214 at this rate and the remaining 26 at this rate after we've deducted the RRSP amount. So again, this little format, make sure we know this. If the person is self-employed, they also have to pay CPP. So we've calculated her tax payable, but she also has to pay CPP, both employee and employer portion. So we end up, for her, being able to calculate that she owes just about $60,000. We have here, we'll just kind of buzz through it here, but you can see we have Roland with his employment income. He's got an automobile deduction. Again, this is more Chapter 3 stuff. We're not going to get, like, we covered auto benefits and all the things of that nature back in Chapter 3. So we're not going to, like, stuff that you kind of already did that way. That will certainly not be the focus. So you're not going to have a whole question on Chapter 3 material, digging deep, that type of thing. Let's see. So he had an RRSP calculation inside his as well. So he had his opening balance, and then the lesser of the 2020 dollar limit and 18% of the earned income from the previous year. Pension adjustments. Sometimes the pension adjustment will be given. And sometimes, like on your assignment, you will have to do the simple calculation of what the pension adjustment is. In this question, the pension adjustment was given. But in the assignment question, for example, the pension adjustment, you had $7,600 paid by the employee and an additional $7,600 paid by the employer. They were matching. So your pension adjustment on the assignment should be both amounts. So in the assignment, again, it was a little more detailed. You had to calculate the pension adjustment, but it's just the amount that was paid into the pension. Past service pension adjustment is a different thing. That would just be given if you have, like in here, it was calculated, but it was shown here. So that could be in there as well. But the pension adjustment would be either given or it's just going to be what was paid into the pension. It's pretty straightforward. Now, the past service pension adjustment is based on a formula given in the question here. So we calculated his room. He made contributions of $4,500. So that is his deduction. So when we calculated his taxable income, it was his net income minus the RRSP. So you could have a question that says, you know, this person had this investment income, this employment income, and here's their RRSP, you know, what's their taxable income? And you just have to, just the basic understanding of what we're doing here is adding all the income sources and subtracting all the deductions, running it through the tax bracket, and then calculating some basic tax credits, right? So everyone has access to the basic personal amount. If you're an employee, you're going to have EI, CPP, Canada Employment. Make sure you always, like if you're if the taxpayer is an employee, you're always going to have all four of those. So those are kind of easy points. We did, you know, medical expenses and things like that. We did those before the midterm, like those were included on the midterm. So we're not trying to re-examine detailed questions you might have done before. So focus your studies definitely on chapter 5 through 10, but just make sure you're still comfortable with this basic way that everything comes together, right? How does it all those chapters, how do they all work together? Because there's a little bit of bringing it together at the end here so we can put a bow on it. So this would be the little piece from chapter 4. And additionally, I think that's just the calculation of that. Additionally, the last thing that I'd like to kind of point out for this question, all of this is the calculation of tax payable. So that's the calculation of your tax for the year. In addition to that, I'll do a little bit of scribbling. In addition to that, you could also have a fact such as, you know, perhaps the person was, remember we learned about installment payments way back in chapter 2? Well, what if the person did make installments? Again, we're not going to calculate installments again. Oops. So installments, CRA tends to spell it with one L, you know, two L's, whatever. I'll do it the CRA way. So installment payments that have already been made, those ones say that were required back in chapter 2, here's where those would come in. So to bring it full circle, say this person had paid in, let's say, well, let's make the math easy for me here. Let's do $3,000. So if they had paid in installments of $3,000, the bottom line is going to be 148. So payable. So the question, if the question, you know, or let's use the word owing. The whole thing was payable, but this is what's remaining as owing. If the question asks you specifically, or gives you information about how much the taxpayer has already paid, then you can, you can calculate their federal tax. But then if they've already made payments, do that one extra step to, this is what you would do in real life to let the client know what they owe. So, for example, we sent a corporate tax return to a client yesterday. On the corporate tax return, they owed $14,000. So we give them that. We let them know that they owe that the return has an annual amount owing of $14,000. But that's not the whole story. We also did our due diligence to see what installment payments had already been made by the client. We include that information and say, by the way, your tax bill was $14,000. You made installments of, say, $6,000. Your remaining amount owing is $8,000. And in addition to that, based on our calculations, you're going to have to pay $1,200 a month in 2021. That's what your new installment base is. You're going to have to pay $1,200 each month and give them the schedule of those payments. So at the end of the day, that's what people are looking for when you're doing their taxes, right? Just like you would be, you'd go to H&R Block, you go to wherever. What do I owe? And is there anything else I need to do or anything else I need to know? So that would be the final item, right? So now this installment payments thing, I just made that up. That wasn't in the question. But as an example, the question could also say installment payments were already made. Or if it's an employee, it could be, here's how much was already withheld, right? Here's how much that was already withheld at source. So, that just means that it was taken off your check already. So if you saw withheld at source, that's you'd get that from your T4, right? It just kind of tells you what your taxes paid are. So that's what you would have, for like an employee. You'd always have taxes already taken off. You get your check and a bunch of money's already off of it. CPP, EI, taxes. That's where we would get all these numbers from. But there could be one more, which is how much has already been paid in. So the question might say, how much does Laura have left to pay? When is that amount due? There still could be a point or two on when is this tax return due for filing, and when does the amount, when is it due for payment, the remaining amount owing. So one other little thing that could come back is those due dates. Make sure you're comfortable with when these things would be due. So a little bit, it could be, say, 10% of the exam, if I'm just a rough number, could be from those basics that we've learned. And then the other 90% is all straight from chapter 5 to 10. Again, if we've talked about a topic in class, then it's surely an item that you should refresh on. If we have given it no coverage, it's like it's not in an assignment, we didn't talk about it in class, we didn't do a sample question, then don't worry about it. So we'll focus on the stuff we looked at in class. Let me see here if there's anything else I should mention. I think, well, let me give you a quick, here, I'll just, let's see here. Let's go to a blank page here. So what I'll do, we got, like 17 minutes here. I'm going to do a quick rundown of anything here I can think of, just as a quick summary here of what to make sure that you're ready for. And then if you guys have any questions, you can feel free to ask. So number one, we go do these chapters in order. We start with chapter 5, because again, this is the focus. We're focusing on, this is for the exam. We're focusing on chapter 5 to 10. And we've already talked to you, right? A little bit of that knowledge from the first 4 chapters will be very helpful as well. So chapter 5, make sure that you are good with your basic CCA calculations. Don't forget about recaptures, terminal losses. You may have to calculate that sort of a thing. What else can I tell you here? I mean, that's pretty straightforward, I think, with chapter 5. It's really pretty much a number crunching type of a chapter. We've already, so I'll leave it there. That's for chapter 5, right? Your basic calculations, but don't forget terminal loss, recapture, those types of scenarios that can come into play. Also, in the big picture, what we were just talking about, don't forget about that. Being able to bring it all together and calculate, does this person owe money or do they have a refund, right? Do they, what do they owe? Don't forget that a taxpayer who has business income owes both tax and CPP, right? That's chapter 6. Like for chapter 6, you know, there's, let me just, for chapter 6, you know, you're going to have a scenario where you're given information about a person's business, similar to what we've looked at. You know, they might have a home office deduction you need to calculate. They may have some capital assets they need to calculate CCA on. There could be expenses that aren't deductible that you have to choose, right? Like we said, like a business attire or something like that. So there's going to be expenses you need to appropriately handle and calculate their business income. What else can I tell you here? Rental income, right? If we get into chapter 7, you know, be prepared to do a little bit of calculations on rental income. CCA comes in on that again. So CCA worms its way into chapter 5, 6, and 7, right? So that one kind of spreads itself out a little bit. So be ready to use that inside of each of those chapters. So for chapter 7, if you have a rental income property, you'd calculate your rental income, the appropriate deductions before CCA, and then remember you have a limitation to how much CCA you can claim. You can only get to 0. Remember, we have a similar limitation with home office expenses. So there can be some calculations around that. Your dividend income, right? Remembering how to gross that up, how to do your tax credits, that sort of thing. We covered shares when we got to when we got to chapter 8. We had scenarios where you were buying and selling what we would call identical properties. So if you had the same shares and we used average cost in order to cost those out, you could have timing of a few sales and have to calculate what that capital gain would be, as well as the taxable portion. That's all fair game. We learned about personal use property and listed personal property with all those weird little rules and the $1,000 rule, stuff like that. That is all fair game for a question. When we got to chapter 9, we spent time more recently here on moving expenses and childcare expenses. Now, on the exam, the questions on the exam will not be, generally speaking, will not be as complex as your assignment questions, right? We have to work with a certain amount of time. It is a 3-hour exam period with, I think I have it set for, let me double check here. I think I have 15 minutes of buffer on either end. Let's see. Here we go. Yeah, so the final exam, which is on the 15th, by the way. So you will have access to that exam at 1:45. So 15 minutes before the official exam period. I like to give a little buffer time just so you guys can get it, download it, print it. Same idea as we did for the midterm. So that's when it will be accessible. And then it's a 3-hour exam, so from 2 to 5. Then at 5:15, that is your drop dead time for submission. So submit it at that time. That's lots of time, 3.5 hours. So make sure you get it in by 5:15. And you'll just same way as we did the midterm, you'll upload it. So because you have that 3 hours, again, make sure you manage your time appropriately. Don't, if there's a little tiny obscure thing you're trying to find out, it might be worth 1 point. Don't spend a half hour on it. Get as much done as you can. But the individual questions will not be as complex as maybe some of the questions you had on your assignments. For instance, as an example, if you had a really complex scenario in a moving expense on your assignment, there will be a moving expense question on the exam, but it's not going to be that big, right? Because we do want to fit in samplings of each of the topics and still fit it into that 3-hour, 3.5 hour time period. So there are 6 questions. They do tie themselves in generally to the 6 chapters after the midterm. And with the exception that there can be a little extra layering onto those questions. So you could have somebody with business income where you do some calculations of business income, but then also have to tell me how much do they owe. So you got to do a little bit more. So that's possible as well. The exam is open book. Tax, to me, tax is not memorization. It's more about understanding the theories and how things work. And we don't need to memorize all the little detailed facts and figures. We can refer to our sources, in this case, the textbook, in order to work that out. You guys can also, use the CRA website or any of the other sources we mentioned back in our early classes. Any of those other sources, the Tax Act, any other publications or any of the publications CRA has put out, guides or anything like that, you can feel free to use any of that stuff, your old assignments, any of that type of stuff. In order to be more efficient, if it was me, I would have some little basic templates already set up. Like I would use my assignments where I maybe had some templates in Excel and just kind of have that stuff, the basics ready so that I wasn't starting from scratch. But that's, to each their own. It's most important, though, that you have a good general understanding for the topic matter. That'll make it a lot easier so that you're doing less referring to the text and digging for obscure things. So a good basic general understanding will help kind of speed things along. But I can say this, there's not one giant comprehensive question. There's basically a question for each chapter, and the particular question, such as something like a moving expense, will have some complications to it, but it's not going to be, a moving expense question, that shouldn't take you an hour to do it. It's not going to be that large of a question type thing. Time-wise, the complications will not be that many. So one of the questions, even though they're chapter by chapter, one of them will bring in a little bit of that, how do you calculate how much do I owe, when is it due, that sort of thing that we've been talking about this class. And also chapter 5, again, chapter 5 sprinkles itself. The CCA chapter, it sprinkles itself through 3 different chapters. So you could have a chapter 5 question that clearly is a bit of CCA, but then you can also have some CCA in your chapter 6 question, and you could have some CCA in your chapter 7 question as well. So that one kind of sprinkles itself throughout. But generally speaking, it's 6 questions, 1 for each of those core chapters. I think that's everything I can think of to mention right now. General format is going to be the same as the midterm as far as how we do this. Like I said, the exam will be available at 1:45, upload it to the Dropbox by 5:15. The Dropbox is already there. There's also, I will be online for any questions. I've got a virtual classroom set up for 1:45. So I'll hop on the virtual classroom and get things rolling at 1:45, and I'll be there for the entirety of that to answer any questions. Did you guys have any other questions or anything that you wanted to ask? Between now and the exam, I'll be available. If you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. That's the best way to reach out to me. Shoot me an email, and if we need to have a chat, we can set up what I like to do is set up one of these virtual classrooms to have meetings with students, and then if we need to pull up any resources, we can go through questions or anything. So if you need any extra help leading up to the exam, feel free to reach out. And otherwise, that's about it. We will see you all on the 15th. Good luck with your other exams, and have a great day. All right. Have a good one, guys.